There have been a lot of smart players in baseball history. Some are known for their intellectual feats off the field. Mets pitcher Ron Darling, for example, attended Yale. Catcher Mo Berg served as an undercover spy for the CIA during the Second World War. Reggie Jackson was rumored to have an IQ of 160, though Reggie himself might have started that rumor. Others were known as exceptional students of the game. Tony Gwynn and Ted Williams turned hitting into a science with their relentless pursuit of perfection. But perhaps no ballplayer has ever been revered for his genius as much as the professor himself, Hall of Fame pitcher Greg Maddux. Sure, this was partly because Maddux looked the part. From his eyeglasses to his wiry, seemingly unathletic physique, the right-hander appeared as if he belonged in a public library or at an accountant's convention, not in the mound pitching against the Yankees in Game 1 of the World Series. Beneath the unassuming, somewhat nerdy physique, however, Greg Maddux was a freak of nature, and whatever he lacked in physical advantages he made up for and then some with his ability to identify an opposing batter's weak spots and exploit them. The result was a career that included 4 Cy Young Awards, 4 ERA titles, 8 All-Star appearances, 18 Gold Glove Awards, and more than 3,000 strikeouts, 300 victories, and 5,000 innings pitched. For 4 unforgettable years in the 1990s, which was one of the best decades for hitters in baseball history, Maddux posted a 1.98 ERA. He was head and shoulders above most of his pitching peers, and it was because of the head on those shoulders. So, let's dig into why there'll never be another Greg Maddux. Maddux's father was in the Air Force, so young Greg grew up all over the place, ranging from homes as far apart as Texas to Spain. But baseball was one constant for both him and his older brother Mike. Eventually, the Maddux family landed in Las Vegas permanently, where his brother would get drafted by the Phillies and Greg would lead Valley High School to a state championship on the mound. Maddux, at the time, had a slender build and relied on late movement and a good 12-6 curveball to get hitters out. He didn't exactly turn heads with his velocity, but scouts didn't view him as a soft tosser early in his career either. Just a pitcher with roughly average velocity who was on his way up and would hopefully gain some oomph eventually to go along with his control and movement. He was still scraping 90 on many of his offerings after all. Maddux was drafted in the second round by the Chicago Cubs in 1984, with him deciding to accept the bonus they offered and pass on college at Arizona. He put that bonus money away in the bank and lived off his minor league salary and the money he earned from off-season jobs at Sears and Wendy's. Greg worked his way through the minors in 1984 and 85, earning a call-up with the Cubs in September 1986 when he was still just 20. His major league debut was unusual. He was called on in the 18th inning of a marathon game against the Astros. It wouldn't be the best debut in history. He gave up a run and got the loss. But 4 days later, he got his first start and earned a complete game victory over the Reds. In his last start of the season, he pitched against his brother Mike, a starter for the Phillies, and beat him. Aside from these highlights, a 5.52 ERA denoted a pitcher in need of experience and more than a little seasoning. 1987 was about as rough. In his first full season in the majors, Maddux was extremely wild, a crazy thought now looking back for sure, as his walk rate was an astronomical 4.3 per 9. His ERA of 5.61 was the worst in the National League, and his 76 ERA plus made him 24% worse than an average big league pitcher. He was even shipped back to the minors mid-season to help him get his head on straight. It didn't seem to help much, however. In the last 6 weeks of the season, the Cubs lost all 7 of Maddux's starts, with opponents hitting .347 against him. After that disastrous season, Maddux and his brother played winter ball in Venezuela together. Greg focused on improving his curveball, getting more grounders overall, and building his confidence. At this point, his circle changeup, a pitch that would come to be of the utmost importance to him, hadn't even made an impact yet. That offseason of obsessively working had a major effect. Maddux exploded out of the gate in 1988, earning his first All-Star appearance. He won 18 games, had a .318 ERA, and an above-average 1.14 ERA+. This was also the first year of a truly incredible streak, even if it's seemingly less so by today's standards. For the next 17 years, Maddux would win 15 or more games every single season. That's something no pitcher has ever done, or likely ever will do again. In 1989, he was even better, winning 19 games with a 2.95 ERA, finishing third in the NL Cy Young race. He also helped lead the Cubs to the National League Championship Series against the San Francisco Giants. But in that series, the Giants shelled Maddux, who gave up 8 runs, and they would go on to beat the Cubs and advance to the World Series. Maddux won a respectable 15 games in both 1990 and 1991, earning his first 2 Gold Gloves along the way while posting ERA pluses of 1.19 and 1.16 respectively. At this point, Maddux was more of a truly solid pitcher than an all-timer, as he was known as an innings eater who could consistently outperform his FIP, fielding independent pitching. But then, 1992 rolled around. Maddux started the year accumulating 10 wins by early July and being selected for his second All-Star game. At the break, he had a 2.40 ERA and 4 complete games. But here's the crazy thing. He only got better as the year wore on. In his final 16 starts after the All-Star break, Maddux logged a dazzling 1.93 ERA, throwing 5 complete games to go along with a nearly 3-to-1 strikeout-to-walk ratio. He finished the year with 20 wins, a 2.18 ERA, and a league-leading 1.66 ERA+, beating out Atlanta ace Tom Glavine to win his first Cy Young Award. This wouldn't be the last time Maddux and Glavine's name would be mentioned in the same breath, however. After the '92 season, Maddux became a free agent for the first time in his career. The Yankees looked like the frontrunners to land him, but apparently Greg turned down their offer of $34 million to take $28 million from the Braves. He thought that Atlanta would be a better place to raise a family than New York, and that it would be enriching to work alongside a staff that included John Smoltz, Steve Avery, and the aforementioned Glavine. As fate would have it, Maddux's first start in a Braves uniform came against his former club at Wrigley Field. Cubs fans treated Maddux to a chorus of boos, and then he treated them to a shutout. By the time he joined the Braves, Maddux was already regarded as the smartest pitcher in baseball. He studied videotape of hitters constantly, looking for weak spots and devising plans on how to best get them out. He even watched them take warm-up swings. Maddux now relied on a refined repertoire that included a curveball, circle change, slider, two-seamer, and four-seam fastball. None of these pitches profiled as truly elite, aside from his two-seamer at times, but his preparation, change of speeds, and immaculate control allowed him to set up hitters like no other, and keep them off balance consistently. In Atlanta, Maddux was also joining a team that had won the last 2 NL pennants and boasted the aforementioned extremely impressive rotation. The Braves would indeed give up the fewest runs in the league in 1993 en route to winning 104 games, with new arrival Maddux again being dominant, winning 20 games and leading the league with 267 innings and an ERA of 2.36. He would also receive his second straight Cy Young Award. Unfortunately, Maddux again faltered in the postseason. After helping the Braves to victory in Game 2 of the NLCS against Philadelphia, he gave up 6 runs in Game 6, and the Phillies beat the Braves to advance to the World Series. The baseball strike ended the 1994 season early, but prior to that, Greg Maddux was on his way to one of the greatest seasons any pitcher had enjoyed in decades. Maddux had dominated the league for the past few seasons, but in 1994, he absolutely destroyed it. Before the season was halted, Maddux had an almost unfathomable 1.56 ERA in more than 200 innings. 1.56. In 25 starts, he won 16 games and had 10 complete games, and his control was simply superhuman. He walked only 31 batters versus 156 strikeouts. He also posted a 2.71 ERA+, meaning he was almost 3 times better than an average big league pitcher. By the numbers, the chasm between Maddux and the rest of the league was greater than it had even been for Bob Gibson in 1968 when he had a 1.12 ERA and an ERA+ of 2.58. Not surprisingly, Maddux won his 3rd straight Cy Young. But here's what's crazy, Maddux was arguably even better when play resumed in 1995. That year, Maddux went 19-2 with a minuscule 1.63 ERA and over 200 innings again. He threw another 10 complete games, walking just 23 batters all season. His strikeout-to-walk ratio and whip of 0.811 were even lower than they had been in 1994. His ERA+ was only 11 points worse at 2.60. Sports writers were now discussing him being the best right-handed pitcher since Walter Johnson. Unsurprisingly, Maddux won a 4th Cy Young in a row, while finishing 3rd in MVP voting. This would also be the season he would finally get over the hump in the playoffs and make it to his first World Series. Maddux started Game 1 against Orel Hershiser and the Cleveland Indians. The first batter he would face, Kenny Lofton, would reach base on an error, eventually coming around to score. After that, Maddux shut the Indians down completely, throwing a 2-hit complete game on just 95 pitches. The Braves went on to win the series in 6 games, capturing their first World Series title in Atlanta. Maddux, now 30, returned back to earth a bit in 1996, at least relatively speaking. After all, most pitchers would have killed for the 2.72 ERA and 1.60 ERA+ he posted that year. These less than astounding numbers meant he would fail to repeat a Cy Young for the 5th year in a row. Regardless, he would again find success in the postseason, helping the Braves return to the World Series, where he pitched 8 scoreless innings in Game 2 against the Yankees. He would be the losing pitcher, however, in Game 6, as the burgeoning dynasty that would come to define the 90s claimed the first of 4 World Series titles they would win in the next 5 years. Maddux returned to form in the 1997 season with a record of 19-4, a 2.20 ERA, and a 1.89 ERA+. In more than 230 innings, he walked just 20 batters. He would also lead the league in home run rate for the 4th time in his career up to this point, at a minuscule 0.3 per 9. This year also contained perhaps the most iconic game he would ever pitch. Facing his old team, the Cubs, in the first game of a July doubleheader, Maddux took his command to a new level. The professor needed just 78 pitches, shout out Foolish Baseball, that afternoon to beat the Cubs in a complete game masterpiece that took just 2 hours and 7 minutes. Maddux allowed 0 runs and did not walk a batter while striking out 6. He started 26 of the 31 batters he faced with strikes, and only 2 Chicago batters even reached a 2-ball count. Nowadays, if a pitcher throws a complete game shutout in fewer than 100 pitches, it's known as a Maddux, in large part due to this specific game. Maddux would remain one of the top pitchers in the majors throughout the rest of the decade, finishing every season in the top 5 of the Cy Young voting while posting at least 15 wins with an ERA under or near 3 every season except 1999, when he had an ERA of 3.57. During this streak, he would also exceed a 140 ERA plus every year except that same 99 season. It was also in this year that the Yankees beat the Braves again in the World Series. Maddux pitched the opening game and carried a 1-0 lead into the 8th inning before giving up 4 runs. The Braves ended up getting swept. This was part of the overall narrative of Greg's career. He always seemed to pitch well in the postseason with a 3.27 ERA and nearly 200 postseason innings, but he was never nearly as dominant as he was during the regular season. During the early 2000s, Maddux was no longer winning Cy Youngs or posting WARs above 9, but he was still getting batters out and racking up wins, innings, and Gold Glove awards. In 2001, Maddux even set a National League record by throwing 72 1/3 straight innings without a walk. The streak was snapped by an intentional walk. At the end of the 2003 season, Maddux again became a free agent, and after a mind-blowingly successful decade in Atlanta, he elected to return to the Cubs on a 3-year, $24 million contract. And after heading back to the city where he had started his career, Maddux began notching some pretty major pitching milestones. In that same Cubs uniform again, Maddux won 16 games in 2004 at age 38. However, his ERA swelled to 4.02, the first time his ERA had been above 4 since his first full season in Chicago back in 1987. Regardless, that August he earned his 300th career victory with an 8-4 win over the Giants. This made him just one of 24 pitchers in history to achieve that mark, and perhaps one of the last. The following season, Maddux crossed another historic barrier, notching his 3,000th career strikeout. Maddux is one of only 10 pitchers in history to have at least 300 wins and 3,000 career punchouts in a career. His ERA was again over 4, however, now at 4.24. The professor's class was nearly out. He managed to hang on for a few more seasons, having stints in both Los Angeles and San Diego. While he wasn't particularly effective, he was working at this point with the low to mid-80s fastball, and still surviving enough to give decent inning totals. Maddux's last game would be in relief for the Dodgers in the final game of the 2008 National League Championship Series. Greg Maddux never had Nolan Ryan's fastball, or Pedro Martinez's changeup, or Randy Johnson's slider. His heater topped out at 88 to 90 miles per hour, and at 6 feet 170 pounds, he had to be one of the least physically intimidating pitchers of that time period. So, how did Maddux become the best pitcher in baseball for years in the 1990s, an era known for its juiced hitters? What made him so special? Maddux once told a reporter that it's not a speed contest, it's a pitching contest. And that's what Maddux knew so well, the true science of pitching a baseball. That knowledge earned him nicknames such as Mad Dog and the Professor, but Maddux really was a magician, whose sleight of hand on the mound seemed to alter the fabric of how the game is played. This sleight of hand can be broken down into 5 central components. Number 1, the late movement. As we said, Maddux didn't have an excess of velocity, but he did have phenomenal late movement. One of Maddux's best pitches was the backup slider after all, a notoriously hard pitch for righties to throw consistently. It would look like an inside pitch designed to back a right-handed batter up, and then at the last split second it would break across the inside corner. Oh, and he could also throw a front door two-seamer that could do the same thing to left-handed batters. Number 2, the control. To make the most of the late-breaking action on his pitches, Maddux needed incredible control. He used to say that the best pitch in baseball is a well-located fastball. An accurate fastball sets up everything else after all. And he could indeed throw his two-seamer pretty much wherever he wanted, which was especially useful in the 90s when strike zones were seemingly bigger than ever. He would take an inch off the edge, and if the ump gave it to him, he'd keep getting further away. Number 3, the pitch arsenal. It wasn't just the fastball Maddux could control after all. He could throw every pitch in his arsenal, his circle change, his curve, his slider, his four-seamer, perfectly in the center of the smallest of targets, while also changing speeds in subtle ways to both frustrate hitters and throw off their balance. Number 4, intuition. There were times when it seemed like Maddux didn't just have control over the mound, but over reality itself. For example, one time Braves manager Bobby Cox visited Maddux on the mound with runners on first and third and 2 outs. He suggested that Maddux intentionally walk the batter. Maddux told Cox that his plan was to get the batter to hit a foul pop-up to third base on the 3rd pitch. Cox returned to the dugout, and Maddux somehow managed to do exactly that. The history of Maddux is littered with stories like this. Here's another. Apparently he once told center fielder Otis Nixon to move back and to stand just on the edge of the warning track and not move a muscle. The batter hit a ball directly at Nixon, who then told reporters the story, noting that he barely even had to move his glove to catch it. Number 5. The mental edge. Part of Maddux's hold on reality was in his preparation. He was able to read hitters and exploit their weaknesses, then file that information away for future use. If Maddux struck you out in April, he'd remember exactly the pitch sequence he had used so they could get you out again in September. There were also smaller, more subtle things that added up and made Maddux even more impressive than your average hurler. While many pitchers waste a pitch trying to get a batter to chase on an 0-2, Maddux would instead attempt to throw a strike that would induce weak contact, almost as if the count was still 0-1. He might not have gotten the strikeout, but he would get the out overall, and throw fewer pitches doing it. Another thing that Maddux said that he did in order to get a mental edge on certain hitters was to let them have some success against him, usually in a spring training game or in a situation where his team had a comfortable lead. That's right, he would intentionally help hitters grow overconfident against him so that when they faced each other in a more meaningful situation in the future, he had the upper hand. Maddux also believed in what he called stealing strikes. He would study which batters would let him get away with the first pitch strike in certain situations. He said there are several circumstances in a game where a batter will just give you a strike, and you have to take every opportunity to exploit that when you can. Greg Maddux retired in 2008 as one of the best right-handed pitchers in the history of the game, being elected to the Hall of Fame on his first ballot. His number 31 has been retired by both the Cubs and the Braves. What's more, his career totals that he spent 23 years accumulating are absolutely nuts, and likely will never be reached again. 355 career wins, the most of any modern pitcher since Warren Spahn, 5,000 innings pitched, 18 Gold Gloves, including 13 in a row, and a streak of 4 consecutive Cy Youngs at one point. That's why we at MTC believe we can confidently say there'll never be another Greg Maddux. Thanks for watching, everyone. Leave a like if you enjoyed the vid and click this playlist for other essay videos just like this one. Have a great day.